2024 has been a pretty big year for the channel, hitting our first 1,000 subscribers, 2,000 subscribers, welcoming new animals, and many amazing projects throughout the year. To round out 2024, I'll be taking you all on a tour of the animal room and taking a look at all the enclosures that make this room what it is, as well as picking my favorite project of the year and talking about the future of the channel. If you're new around here, make sure and hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss future videos. The channel as of right now has been going for over 2 years, and I've never really done an animal room tour video. The reason being is I've never really had enough stuff to do it, but this year's brought so many more amazing projects that I've finally been able to do this for you guys. So without further ado, let's take a look at the 2024 animal room. To kick things off, I'll do a quick overview of the closet. This is where I keep things like animal feeding supplies, water maintenance tools, as well as a bunch of other materials that make my projects possible. This is also where I propagate things like various mosses and ficus, and as well as where I keep my springtails and isopods. On the bottom shelf I have my bin full of driftwood, my bins full of all my scaping stones, and crickets for the frogs. It's not the most exciting, but this storage unit is crucial for what I do. Having organized materials allows me to more effectively create projects, as well as have an organized space to store things. Moving on to the first enclosure, we have the 75-gallon axolotl paludarium. Although most of the plants have died, the ones that have stayed thrive. All of the peace lilies and pothos are thriving, as well as the aquatic plants. This tank has been, and probably still is, my favorite project to date. And although the tank itself is beautiful, what really makes it special is who lives in it. I've had my axolotl Bubbles for over 6 years, and although he's had some health issues in the past, he's doing great to this day. I love interacting with him, and he's definitely one of my favorite animals in the room. He's also one of the most interactive animals in the room. Anytime I step into the room, he's always up front in the tank and wants to know what I'm doing. He's also one of my biggest animals, measuring in at 13.5 inches, and with a big animal comes a big appetite. Axolotls will eat just about anything that comes in front of their face, but their absolute favorite is worms, night crawlers to be specific. Once he sees it, he doesn't waste a second. Older axolotls like himself aren't very big eaters and only eat a couple worms a week. However, once he has a full belly, he's about as happy as can be. Overall, he's doing great. I do intend on upgrading him sometime in the future, but for now, his tank will serve properly. Besides adding a couple more plants and a few minor changes, I'm very pleased with how this tank has held up over time. Moving over to the right, we have the second enclosure on the list, which is the gecko vivarium. This has been one of my most successful vivariums in terms of plants. The plants have been thriving and taking over the scape, and my gecko is absolutely loving it. Crested geckos are nocturnal, so she spends her days hanging on plant leaves and just chilling. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how her tank looks and functions, but I feel like I could do a bit better. Though the plants are thriving, there isn't as much hiding spaces as I would like for her. As you can see here, you can see pretty much straight to the back of the tank, and there aren't really that many spaces where she can hide if she ever feels threatened. For that reason, I'll be redoing her enclosure hopefully early this year, as well as making a new one for the lychee gecko. As previously mentioned, she's enjoying her tank. She doesn't love handling all the time, but occasionally I get her out to spend a little bit of time with her. She's only a couple years old and still has a lot of energy, so she likes to climb on the branches and explore her enclosure. However, every now and then she finds a good sleeping spot and decides to take a little nap. Overall, she's doing great and I love having her around, but her enclosure needs a bit of an upgrade. I'm hoping to get that done fairly early on this year, maybe in the first few months or so. Since making this, I've greatly refined my skills and can definitely do a much better job. Moving on, we have the newest enclosure in the animal room, the 55-gallon axolotl paludarium. I set this tank up last week, and it's meant to house my 8-month-old axolotl, Ember, who is the newest addition to the animal room. With this tank being fairly new, a couple of the plants are having a hard time adjusting, with others thriving. Unfortunately, she's not in the tank yet as I have to let the filter cycle and test a few parameters, but overall the tank is doing very well. Though she's very small right now, she'll eventually grow a lot bigger, and axolotls are very destructive. For that reason, while making this, I tried to keep it as simplistic as possible. Not much change in the week that I've had this up, but overall I'm really happy with how this tank turned out. Moving over to one of my biggest projects of the year, we have the 40-gallon frog rack. Both these are front opening enclosures that house my tree frog pairs. Starting off with the mossy frogs on the left, and as you can see, the tank is not looking so hot. The main problem here has been the plants. For some reason I've been able to get very little plants to survive in this setup, and I'm really not sure why. Lots of them I've used in setups like this before, and I've had great success with them. However, for some reason in this setup, they just aren't working. Besides the plant issue, this is actually one of my favorite setups in the room. The reason for that is because of the scape and the background. This was my first time attempting a new background in Scape, and I really love the way it turned out. The frogs themselves seem to love the tank. They found a new hiding spot where I can't find them, and I suspect it's behind the Scape. Once the lights go out, however, the frogs come out to hunt crickets and do silly frog things. Mossy frogs have been one of my favorite species that I've ever kept. Their personalities are unique, and their looks are even more so. So besides the plant issue, this tank has definitely been one of my favorite projects of the year, and I hope to get it figured out soon. The next enclosure is the second newest to the room, and that's the red-eyed tree frog vivarium. This was one of my longer projects, taking over a couple months to complete, and although some of the plants aren't doing so well, the bromeliads are thriving, which is the important thing. I intend on replacing the dead plants, as well as adding a couple more to the ground area, as it feels a bit bare. The water feature has held up well so far, and although I have no visual proof that the frogs have been in it, there have been a couple signs. Speaking of the frogs, it seems like they're loving this enclosure. They both love sleeping on the bromeliads and soaking up the heat during the day. These are definitely the most beautiful animals in the room, and although I don't see them that often, they're still very fun to observe in this enclosure. For this enclosure, I was able to perfectly capture that tropical vibe that I wanted, and this is definitely a major improvement from previous red-eyed tree frog tanks. I'll need to tend to a couple of the plants, but overall this tank has held up well and is still going strong. The next stop on the list is the mantis rack. This whole project has kind of been a mess, but I'm honestly really happy with how it's taking shape. I do intend on filling this up a lot more with more mantises, but more on that later. Overall, the enclosures aren't doing that great. The plants have mostly died throughout all of them, but the scape in the background have remained intact. One of the biggest problems is that I was experimenting with different substrates for these, so the substrates have not been ideal for the plants that have been in them. It's a running theme throughout every tank, but the mantises themselves are doing great, and I love having them around. I've loved mantises from a very young age, and I really enjoy keeping them around like this. They're very unique animals, and definitely worth the time to keep them. Though it's technically not a mantis enclosure, the orange dairy cow isopod vivarium is also on this rack. Using almost exclusively new techniques on this one made it one of my most fun projects of the year. Though some of the plants have been lost, the ones that are staying are thriving. The ficus, as well as some of the ivies, are doing great, as well as most of the moss. Unfortunately, almost all of the isopods have died. I'm really not sure why, and I do see an occasional one pop up every now and then, but most of them have disappeared. Besides that, I really love how this project is holding up, and I would really like to make more like this in the near future. Overall, I'm really happy with how the mantis rack is coming along, and I hope to fill it up in the future. Near the end of 2024, I really didn't have enough money to do this and get more mantises, but going into this year, I hope to get that back in order and get a couple new species. I do have a couple nymphs that are still in temporary enclosures, such as my deadleaf mantis, as well as my beautiful orchid mantis. These guys are still growing and have huge appetites, so I'm going to go ahead and give them a couple roaches. One of the most fascinating aspects about praying mantises is how they catch their food. They have a lightning fast strike that will catch anything that comes in front of their face. As previously mentioned, they're both in temporary enclosures right now, and I intend on doing their enclosures hopefully early this year, with the orchid mantis probably being one of my first projects of 2025. Right next to them sits the Leachianus gecko enclosure. This tank has served its function incredibly well over the time that I've had it set up. Though the gecko is a bit destructive, the plants have managed to grow in quite well. As far as the cork bark, it creates a perfect hiding spot for the little guy. He loves to sit in there during the day and come out at night to explore. However, he is quickly outgrowing this tank. As mentioned earlier, I'll be redoing his tank and making him a new one when I do the crested gecko enclosure. When I first got him, he was only a couple weeks old and measured in at about 2.5 inches. Since then, he has grown quite substantially, measuring in at about 6 inches, and still has a lot of growing to do, so he'll definitely need a bigger enclosure. Surprisingly, the Leachianus gecko has been one of my favorite animals that I've kept. Something about their personalities I've just really enjoyed so far. And with him quickly growing, he's going to need a new tank soon. With the animals out of the way, it's time to take a look at the nano rack, starting in the upper left with the reigning paludarium, or as it's better known now, the ultimate propagation tank. Truth be told, I barely ever use the rain feature anymore, and this has become more of a lush jungle that the plants have taken over, which honestly I'm really happy about. The reigning paludarium is a very cool concept, but overall it's not very practical for viewing. Here you can see how the plants have completely taken over the tank, which again, I'm happy about. I plan on doing a bit of maintenance to this and turning it into a regular paludarium. To the right of that, I have my terrarium collection. At first glance, it's easy to tell that all of the orchids in the orchid terrarium have unfortunately died. Though I'm not sure why, all of the other plants such as the ivy and moss seem to be doing very well. I intend on doing a bit of maintenance to this setup, as well as revisiting the orchid terrarium subject in the near future. Next to those, I have the triple terrariums, which have absolutely gone crazy. Being the only terrariums I've had up for over a year, it's pretty obvious to tell that they've been doing great so far. About a month after these, I ended up making the tree trunk terrarium, which is doing pretty good in of itself. A couple of the plants have died, but for the most part, it's doing pretty good. Overall, my terrarium collection is pretty small, and I really want to work on that this year. Right under these, I have what is my most successful project to date, which is the 3-gallon nano shrimp cube. The plants have been thriving and taking over the entire scape. Here you can see the Java ferns as well as the Anubias and the Salvinia on the top have completely taken over. I actually intend on making a specific grow-out tank for the Salvinia as it's gotten so out of control. In addition to the plants thriving, the shrimp have also been doing the same. As of right now, they've reproduced about 4 times, with more on the way. I initially got 10 shrimp, and I never intended for them to breed. However, something in the tank must have been just right for them to do so. Though it's got a bit of an algae problem and needs a bit of maintenance, the shrimp are absolutely thriving as well as the plants, and like I said earlier, this has been my most successful project to date. The same cannot be said just to the right of it for the desktop riparium. This was honestly more of an experimental build, and I never really intended on keeping it long term. I wanted to see how something like this would work out, and as it's clear, it didn't very well. The technique for holding in the moisture for the plants just didn't work very well, and for that reason I'll have to dismantle it and turn it into something else. On the next shelf over, I have the pair of nano paludariums that I set up earlier this year. At first glance they don't look too great, but both of these projects are actually thriving, with the rabbit's foot fern being the main focus. Some of the other plants haven't done so well as the moss, but overall these tanks are doing very well, and I intend on sprucing them up a bit and bringing them back to life. Just underneath those I have the third nano paludarium, which isn't looking as good as the other two. Honestly, the biggest problem with all three of these is evaporation. The room itself isn't super humid, and the water evaporates rather quickly, making it fairly difficult to keep plants in these setups. I have a couple ideas for that I want to test out in the future for other builds similar to these. Overall, I'm really happy with how the nano rack is coming together. Although some of the projects aren't doing so well and will need to be dismantled, that's kind of the idea for this project. A lot of these, when I make them, I don't intend on keeping them long term. I make them to help refine my skills and learn new things along the way. It's also fun repurposing builds and seeing if I can make them better than before. And that's about it for the 2024 animal room. Overall, I really love this room. It's created a nice area for me to work on projects, as well as an adequate space to keep all my animals in the best enclosures possible. Having a dedicated area like this to help me work on projects allows me to more effectively get things done. I've learned so much throughout this year by making all of these projects, and there have been quite a few of them that I've fallen in love with, but which one is ultimately my favorite of the year? With so many amazing projects taking place this year, it's hard to just pick one. Projects like both of the frog enclosures, as well as the brand new axolotl paludarium, have been some of my favorites of the year, and I really had a fun time making them. Out of every project of 2023 though, my favorite has to be the dairy cow isopod vivarium. This was definitely by far my most fun project of the year. The reason being is that I used a bunch of weird and random new techniques that I never experimented with before. That, combined with the fact of how the final product turned out, makes it my favorite project of the year, and I hope to do more like it in the future. But I'm curious to know, what was your favorite project of 2024? Let me know down in the comments. Now that you've seen the entire animal room, it's time to talk about the future of the channel. In over 2 years of YouTube, I've been able to create quite a few videos, with a lot of them being bigger projects such as animal enclosures. And although these are what I love working on the most, I want to do a lot more smaller projects in the new year. One of the main reasons for that is money. Doing what I do takes quite a bit of money, especially when it comes to the larger animal enclosures. And though I'll still be working on a lot of those, I want to focus a lot more on the smaller projects and come up with creative new ideas. As I said, 2024 has been a pretty big year for the channel, and I'm happy to end it out on a good note. I'm hoping that 2025 will be even bigger, reaching new milestones and learning new things along the way. I want to say a huge thank you to all of you for sticking with me throughout the year and inspiring me to make the best content possible. It's only going to get better, and I hope that you'll stick with me throughout the rest of this year. Anyways, that's going to do it for this one. I hope you all enjoyed the tour. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and I'll see you all for the first project of 2025.